Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about online family trees. More specifically, we're talking about whether those trees should be used as a source or just as a clue. Now, Ancestry has more than 80 million family trees online with more than 10 billion ancestor profiles in those trees. So there's a lot of data available. The question that often comes up, or the debate that sometimes rages, is do we consider these trees and the information in them just clues to pursue in our family history research, or do we cite them as sources for the information we're putting in our family trees? Now, there are a lot of people who have a lot of strong feelings about this one way or the other. So my goal today is not to give you necessarily the definitive answer to that question, but just to broaden your perspective a little bit so that you can engage in that discussion in a useful way and so that you can make good decisions as you build out your own family tree. Now, the majority of what we're going to talk about today actually comes from an article that was written by Dr. Tom Jones. He is on the board for certification of genealogists. He has been the editor of several genealogical magazines. He is a brilliant family historian. I have taken week-long courses from him because I just love learning from him. I buy everything he writes. But he wrote an article back in 2012 for the BCG Onboard magazine called The Perils of Source Snobbery. And one of the things that he starts out that article with is this thought. He says, a genealogist proudly proclaims, of course blank should be used only as a hint for research. Others with similar views routinely exclude certain source types from research plans, whether referring to undocumented and unverified databases, family and local histories, genealogical compendiums, heritage books, old lineage society applications, online family trees, or other categories. The disdain seems intended to show that a researcher has standards. Instead, it betrays misunderstandings of genealogical sources, research, and reasoning. Now, he goes on to talk about some really great things in that article, but you can see here that online family trees are not a new thing as it relates to people putting together genealogies and putting them out in the world. The internet, of course, has sped that up, has made it more accessible to more people, but there have always been this type of information out there. In published family histories, he lists old lineage applications, heritage books, genealogical compendiums, family and local histories. All of these kind of fall into that same bucket or that same category of records that have been compiled or information that has been compiled by another researcher that they are then presenting to the world. Well, online family trees now are a pervasive thing that have that kind of fall into that same category. So let's talk about whether to use them as a source or a clue. And I want to frame our discussion in the context of the genealogical proof standard. If you're not familiar with the genealogical proof standard, if you go to the Ancestry YouTube channel and search for the playlist called Genealogical Proof Standard, I did a 6-video series about this that does a little bit of a deeper dive than we have time to do today. Today we're just going to quickly review the 5 steps of the proof standard and talk about how that relates to online family trees. The first step, of course, is a reasonably exhaustive search, which means that we are going to search whatever records we have available to collect information that we can analyze as evidence for what we put in our family trees. That means that if we are excluding family trees altogether, if we're excluding those published family and local histories that I talked about last week, if we're excluding any published family history book, whether it was published in 1812, 1912, or 2012, we cannot say we have done a reasonably exhaustive search because we haven't looked at all of the information that's available. So I am a huge proponent of using online trees because it means that I have met this portion of the genealogical proof standard. I have done a reasonably exhaustive search. Step 2 of the genealogical proof standard is complete and accurate source citations. That is what we're going to kind of dig into a little bit deeper today, but I just want to give you a high-level overview, which is that anytime you consult a record, and it doesn't matter whether that record is an original birth certificate or an index to that birth or an online family tree or an obituary that was written by someone in the family and published in a local newspaper, or any range of records or sources in between, that if you're using that source, you need to create a citation for it or acknowledge in some way that you have utilized that source, especially if the information from that source is going to play into your conclusion. Now, there are some nuances to this. We could get into the argument about whether or not, if a birth index leads you to an original birth certificate, do you need to cite the index? I personally do not. If I can get my hands on the original, I'm going to use the original, I'm going to cite the original. But if all I can get my hands on is the index, that might be all I use. If the index and the certificate have different information, I have to then analyze that information in order to come to the conclusion that I need to about what is accurate and what is not accurate. So step 3 of the genealogical proof standard is correlation and analysis of information, which means we gather everything we can through that reasonably exhaustive search. We do this source citation, which is not just about where the record came from. It's also extracting all the juicy goodness from the record. It's pulling out all the information. And then we have to correlate all that information across all those different records and analyze it and start to draw some conclusions or set up some hypotheses so that we can continue to move our research forward. The 4th step in the genealogical proof standard is this resolution of conflicting evidence. If you've been involved in family history for more than a minute, you know that there's going to be conflicting information. So you have to be able to say, well, this record says this and this record says this, and these two things conflict, and here's how I'm going to resolve that conflict. There has to be a reasonable explanation for why there's conflicting information. You don't want to just dismiss it out of hand. You don't want to ignore certain records, and that includes online family trees. Okay, so here's the point that Dr. Jones makes in that article that I think is really the crux of this conversation, which is this. There could be original records that have false information on them. So just because you have an original birth certificate or death certificate in hand doesn't mean the information on that record is accurate. There could also be an online family tree that is the only source of a piece of information and it's 100% accurate. So you have to recognize that your process of learning to correlate and analyze information, resolve that conflicting evidence, and then come to a conclusion is part of your process. And for those of you who are brand new, I don't want you to get super overwhelmed by this. Dive in. You will learn as you go. We all did. But for those of you who are a little bit further along in your family history journey, it's time to start thinking about some of these things a little bit more seriously. So that's kind of the framework that I use in my research process. This reasonably exhaustive search, complete and accurate source citations. I'm still working on that one. Correlation and analysis of information. I actually love that step, and there's lots of different tools I use and methodologies I use to do that. Resolution of conflicting evidence. You don't want to skip that step or brush over it. And then come to a soundly reasoned conclusion. What are you putting in your tree and why are you putting it in your tree? Why is this the name you chose, or why is this the birth date you chose for this individual based on all the evidence that you've collected? Sometimes that soundly reasoned conclusion is just entering the information. For me, sometimes it's adding some research notes about why I came to that conclusion. So everybody does it a little bit differently. It's just as much science and art, I think, married together. But start thinking about these things in your own research process if it's something you haven't considered before. And if the genealogical proof standard is of interest to you, I would strongly encourage you, again, to go to the Ancestry YouTube channel, check out the genealogical proof standard playlist. Once you get comfortable with that, there are plenty of other resources out there to continue to learn more about that. Now, let's talk about using online family trees as clues. Now, today we're talking about just online family trees, but remember, based on that quote by Dr. Jones, this can apply to a published family history. It can apply to an application for a lineage society, any number of places where people just publish or put forth their own family history information. So the first question that I often ask myself when I am using family trees as clues is, does this tree have sources attached? If you're not familiar with how that looks or where to find those, if you go into any person on a tree online at Ancestry, go into their person profile. So this is the profile for my third great grandfather, Robert Watson Cowan. You can see here I'm on the Facts tab. And right here in the center, you're going to see sources. So you can see I've got like an 1850 census attached and an 1860, 70, 80. I've got a find a grave record. Now, there are some things there that are attached, some information. I could then go, if this was not my tree, if I was researching and I found your tree, for example, I would want to look at every one of those sources and see, what information was included on that particular record. So you're looking to see, are sources attached to that particular tree. Now, some trees have no sources. One of the reasons Ancestry actually moved those sources right up front and center in the new redesign of the tree system about 1.5 years ago was because we wanted to make sure that people understood the importance of that. They used to be hidden down in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and then it's no wonder that we kind of trained you into this idea that sources don't matter. Well, now they're front and center because we want to make sure that you understand that sources, they matter. And so you may come across a tree that has no sources. That's okay, don't totally discount it. You may come across trees that only have other Ancestry trees as a source. Good, click through and view what other trees they copied their information from. Or you may find trees that have source citations attached for very specific record sets. Now, for those of you who are feeling a little bit overwhelmed because you're still new to this, these Ancestry sources are actually created automatically for you whenever you save or attach a record that you find to a person in your tree. Now, that's awesome because it means you don't have to do all of the crafting of the source citation. It has some pitfalls that you have to be aware of, and one of those is that because the source citation is created automatically, sometimes we don't pay close enough attention to the records. So those of you who've been with me for a while know that one of the things that I do anytime I find a record online is I actually transcribe it into my research notes. So here you can see that 1850 census record transcribed right into my notes, and I did that so that I could, again, make sure I extracted all the juicy goodness, make sure that I understand exactly what this record is saying, how it's spelling his name, how old he's being reported as, where it says he was born, what his occupation is, who he's living with. So I want to understand that record, and so I do that both as part of my source citations and also as part of this process of this correlation and analysis of information. You'll see then that as I collect information and put it into my notes, that I can start to compare information. He's 19 here and he's 28 here. Well, why is the year off a little bit? He's living in Virginia and then Ohio and then Ohio. He says he's born in Pennsylvania. Does that logically make sense, this path of his life? Am I sure I've got the right record for the right person? Like all of that kind of goes into this process as I'm adding information to my family tree about my ancestors. So yay that the source citations are created automatically, but just be careful. Make sure you're not making it too easy. Make sure that the record you're attaching really is for your person. Make sure that you are paying attention to the information in that record in whatever fashion you choose to do that. I choose to use the notes. So does the tree have sources attached? That is an important question to ask. Another question to ask yourself as you look at other people's family trees is, does the tree owner have additional information? Now that's really important, especially one of the things that I've discovered in my own research is that some of the trees that appear to have the least amount of source citations are actually some of the most well-researched trees. But I wouldn't know that if I hadn't contacted the tree owner. Contacting the tree owner tells me if they get my message, if they respond. Oftentimes we start this dialogue about where this information comes from. And one of the things that I've discovered is that a lot of people who do really amazing research and have come to some really accurate conclusions don't have everything online. And my own tree is a perfect example of this. So one of the things that you'll notice here is that I have these census sources and a find a grave source attached to Robert. But up here, I have exact birth dates and places, and a birth date in place and a death date in place. I have detailed information about his relationships here. And all of that is not included in these sources. Census records, for example, only list an age, which gives you an approximate year, and a state of birth. So where did this exact birth date and place come from? Well, his tombstone might list his birth date, but it doesn't always list his birthplace. So all of this information has come to me through various sources over time. As a matter of fact, I've known about Robert Watson Cowan since I was a child. I knew that he was a saddler in the Civil War because that was a story that was passed down in my family history. I had information about his wife because some of the family members that were still alive when I was born had known her. And so they passed down information that had been given to them firsthand that had been given from her. I have family photos. I have papers in boxes in my home and in filing cabinets in my home. And over years, as I have researched his life, like I said, I've added these notes. So my notes don't just include information about the records I've found, like the censuses. They also include information that I have found in other places. So for example, there was an entire history published about Ashland County, Ohio. And from that, there is a whole section or a little biography about Robert Cowan in there. And so I've included the information from that. There's a lot of ways that I've come to these conclusions about who Robert Cowan was and what the major events were in his life and who his relatives are. And all of that is in my files and it's in my notes. It's not all in these source citations. So if you were to come and see my tree about Robert Watson Cowan, you might look at my source citations and say, well, most of the information matches, but I'm not sure where she got this other information. But if you were to contact me and say, I'm interested in learning more about what you know about Robert Watson Cowan, I could provide a ton more information because there's a lot more information behind what you see on your computer screen. Now that was a whole big, long way to just explain that reach out to each other, contact the tree owner, see if they have additional information. Some will be more than willing to share, some might not respond to you at all, some might be a little hesitant to share their research. Everybody kind of has their own way of approaching communication with cousins, but it doesn't hurt to reach out and to just make some inquiries. Another thing that you can do when you're using family trees as clues is to see if you can follow the research path. Can you follow the path using just the information available and research of your own maybe a little bit to see if you can recreate the same conclusion that they came to? And that's kind of where you're going to end up. If you're using a family tree just as a clue, which is perfectly acceptable, you need to see if you can come to the same conclusion or if in collecting evidence you come to a different conclusion. Now remember, that's fourth step of the genealogical proof standard. If you have an online tree that has a conclusion and you come to a different conclusion, how do you resolve that conflicting evidence? Because it is conflicting evidence. And so you have to see if you can resolve it in a meaningful way that makes sense and that you can justify or defend. If you can't, then you haven't really completed the genealogical proof standard. Okay, let's move on then to talk about using trees as sources, which is also perfectly acceptable. As a matter of fact, one of the things that you should keep in mind is that if you are copying information from a tree, that is your source, right? And so you want to make sure that you do cite it as such. That's one of the reasons why when information is copied from one tree to another on Ancestry, we add the source citation of Ancestry online trees because we want to make sure that you and others who visit your tree have a path back to the original information as often as possible. So when I'm using trees as sources, which I do, one of the things that I often look for is to see how closely is the person I'm looking at in this tree related to the tree creator. So usually all that means is that I just go to the pedigree view of the tree and I click home. And I look at who the home person is in the tree and who their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents are, and maybe dig in a little bit to aunts and uncles and first and second cousins to see if I can find the person that I initially was researching. If the person I was originally researching is the parent or grandparent or aunt or first cousin of the person who owns the tree, well, then maybe they know something I don't know, right? Maybe I need to be careful about what conclusions I'm coming to, because if this person is, the daughter of the individual I'm looking for, she likely knows something I don't know about this person. Now, if it turns out that I can't even figure out how they're related, well, then maybe they're a little bit more distantly related and maybe they don't know. It's just something to keep in mind as you're using those trees. And again, then, if you're using a tree as a source, or how you define that you're using it as a source, are you copying information from somebody else's tree that isn't found in any other source that you have viewed? And that's really important, and it means you're thinking about the names that you're copying and the dates and the places. It also means thinking about the relationships. If, for example, there is no record that exists anywhere that lists Robert Watson Cowan as the son of George Cowan and Jane Kahn, how did the tree owner come to that conclusion? And if you haven't been able to find a single record anywhere, or been able to collect enough indirect evidence to come up with a pretty solid argument that he is the son of these people, if all you're doing is copying that supposition from somebody else's tree to your tree, you need to cite that tree as your source for that information. And there's nothing wrong with doing that, right? The idea is that then I would hope you would go back to that information and continue to try to collect evidence. One of the things that you're going to notice about my tree, if you haven't already, is the title of my tree. My tree is called the Cowan Working Tree, which means that my tree is a working tree, not a conclusion tree. And that's kind of the big division in the genealogy community as it relates to online trees. There are some people who feel like you should not put anything in an online tree till you have proven it 100%, you've completed every part of the genealogical proof standard to come to a particular conclusion. And that's great if that's how you choose to approach your research and you want to keep everything in offline or paper files or however you choose to approach your research process. That is just fine. Go and do. But for me, I have decided that I want to just collect everything I can, and sometimes that means it gets collected in pieces. That means that as I'm engaged in this reasonably exhaustive search, as I'm working through the process of analyzing and correlating information, as I'm attempting to resolve conflicting evidence and sometimes having to go back to step one and pursue the reasonably exhaustive search a little bit more, what that means is that this information lives in my tree and is evolving as more evidence comes to light. And there's nothing wrong with that either. Everybody approaches their research a little bit differently. I just wanted to make it clear in my tree name that if anybody comes across this, that there is a clue there by the name of the tree that this is a work in process. That information might change or get updated as new information comes to light. And so however you choose to approach your research is fine. I would just encourage you that if your tree is public, that you make sure that you look at and respond to messages as often as possible, because people might be reaching out to you to understand more about how you came to the conclusions you came to. I would encourage you that you make the information you put in your tree as accurate as possible, and that if you're copying information from somebody else's tree, make sure that you're doing it in such a way that it creates that source citation so that you and others can follow that path back to the original information, where you can use then those trees as additional clues or see what sources they've used to come to those same conclusions. Now, this topic I could probably treat in a much broader and deeper sense if we had more time. Unfortunately, we don't. So I just want to remind you again about this article by Dr. Tom Jones. You can find it on the Board for Certification of Genealogists website. As a matter of fact, if you just do a search, internet search for Perils of Source Snobbery, that's the name of the article, it should come up and you can read his complete treatment of that. As for myself, I will likely be developing this topic into an hour-long conference topic. So if you ever have the opportunity to attend a genealogy conference where I'm speaking, you might want to take a peek at the title. You may see this topic come up again. Well, that's all I have prepared for you today. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.